It's July 20th, 1969, and a man named Neil Armstrong just stepped out of a spacecraft on the moon. The entire scene is being broadcast on Earth to over 500 million people. He says the magic words, "That is one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." People at home wonder if he'd said that spontaneously or had planned it. We'll never really know, but others have other questions in their mind. What if this isn't a small step for man? What if this is one huge hoax orchestrated by the United States bureaucracy? Over the next 3 years, several other manned crews would go to the moon, demonstrating that human beings can reach space. However, the people who doubted the first landing on the moon would continue to doubt it and would continue to create elaborate explanations that justified their disbelief in the moon landing. If you're new to the world of conspiracy theorists, you might find this a little bit weird. You may assume that the moon landing is settled history and no one truly doubts it, but you'd be wrong. Over the last few decades, a community of conspiracy theorists have continued to propagate their belief that the moon landing was a cleverly staged act. They believe that human beings have never reached the moon, and Armstrong and NASA are just trying to be clever by half. Since the 1970s, various groups have made various claims about the moon landings. One might think that this conspiracy theory is only believed by a few wackos, but that wouldn't be correct. Opinion polls have shown that between 6 and 20% of Americans, 25% of Britons, and 28% of Russians believe that the moon landing was faked. The main reason they give for saying that the moon landing was faked is that the technology to reach the moon was yet to be invented when NASA did it. Others believe that even if the technology was available, other factors like radiation, cosmic rays, and solar flares made the mission impossible. All of these beliefs are driven by a strong distrust of the American government. The conspiracy theorists who push this theory have provided 3 main reasons why they believe that NASA and the United States government would go to great lengths to fake the moon landing. The first reason is the space race. In 1961, President Kennedy told the world that he expected Americans to have reached the moon before the end of the decade. It was an extraordinary statement from Kennedy and showed the world that America was serious about being the first country to reach the moon. Kennedy also said that America wanted to go to the moon, not because it was easy, but because it was hard. It was a not-so-subtle challenge to the Soviet Union. At the time, the space race was already underway and the USSR had already scored some early victories. They had sent the first man to space and were already working on even more ambitious projects. America was still behind in the race, but had every intention of beating the Soviet Union to the moon. In the years that followed 1961, the space race reached a fever pitch. That decade, both countries began designing super heavy lift launch vehicles that could get them to space. Since America was trailing at the time, many people probably expected the Soviet Union to reach the moon first. According to conspiracy theorists, it was this fear of failure that led NASA to do the unthinkable. This fear led the agency to fake the moon landing because they were scared that the Russians would get there before them. The evidence they have for this assertion is that NASA stopped sending people to the moon in 1972, which was about the time the USSR developed the ability to track spacecraft in space. Conspiracy theorists argue that the program was stopped because NASA didn't want the USSR to find out the truth. However, that's not true. First of all, NASA stopped sending people to the moon to save costs. Space expeditions gulped billions of dollars, and Congress was getting impatient with spending that much money on what was essentially a vanity project. They saw no immediate benefits to exploring space and therefore cut costs. Secondly, the USSR had developed spacecraft tracking technology since at least 1959, when they began sending uncrewed aircraft to space. Thirdly, immediately after Neil Armstrong's moon landing, the USSR authorities reported the moon landings as factual. The reason why this point is important is that the Soviets would have raised an alarm and exposed America if they had any proof that the landing was faked. The space war isn't the only reason conspiracy theorists give for believing that the moon landing was faked. Another reason often given is that NASA faked the landing to continue to get funding. As has been said earlier, space exploration is extremely expensive. The Apollo mission, for example, cost about $25 billion at the time. If that's adjusted for inflation today, it would be over $175 billion. That's a lot of money, and NASA couldn't just fail to achieve what the money had been earmarked for. It would have been a disaster and might have led to the closure of the agency, or at least an extreme cleanup of its administrators. So the people who led NASA did what they could to stop that from happening. Since they couldn't reach the moon, they decided to fake the moon landing. Or at least that's what the conspiracy theorists argue. According to these theorists, NASA used most of its money it was given by Congress to pay off hundreds and maybe thousands of people who were in the know about the hoax. The proof of this, they argue, is the fact that NASA would never have broadcasted Neil Armstrong live if they believed something could go wrong. The fact that they didn't believe something could go wrong is proof that the entire process was stage managed. But that's not entirely correct. NASA did take some real risks, and those risks culminated in the Apollo 1 fire during a ground test. The last reason that conspiracy theorists often give is the Vietnam War. They argue that the moon landing was just a way to distract the people from the disastrous war, but that reason doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. While the Vietnam War happened around the same period as the moon landings, the space program ended long before America withdrew from Vietnam. People who believe the moon landings were faked also have some supposed evidence to prove their point. The biggest piece of evidence these theorists have are NASA photos. They point to certain oddities that they say exist in the photos. A popular claim is that we can tell that the NASA moon landing photos were faked because the American flag was moving in them. Since the moon doesn't have an atmosphere, it doesn't make sense that the flag would be flapping in the breeze, and that makes sense. However, the flag's movement isn't really from the wind, but from the inertia of the movement that placed it there. Another argument comes from a picture of Buzz Aldrin's visor. The visor shows that there are only 2 people on the moon at the time, but shows no camera. Conspiracy theorists argue that this shows that someone else photographed them, but that's not true, as the camera in this case was mounted on Neil Armstrong's chest. The cameras were sewn onto the astronaut's suit, so they needn't hold up a camera to get a picture. One more argument from the pictures is that they don't show any stars. First of all, if the moon landing was faked on some studio stage in Texas, one would expect NASA to at least put some blinking lights to signify stars in the sky. They seriously cannot be that incompetent, right? Anyway, the reason why pictures don't have any stars is because the sun's rays reflect off the moon. Since the moon doesn't have an atmosphere, the glare is so bright that it's impossible to capture any stars. While the astronauts themselves would have seen stars, they wouldn't have captured it on their cameras since they were in fast exposure settings. These settings would make it difficult for the camera to capture faint light from the stars. Conspiracy theorists also believe that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin could not have made footprints on the moon because it's a bone-dry world. They argue that the footprints left behind are the sort one would see on wet sand. Since there's no wet sand on the moon, the picture could have only been taken on Earth. But that doesn't make any sense. There's sand on the moon, and moon dust is like finely ground powder. Hence the footprints in the pictures are fairly consistent with what one might expect on the moon. Finally, conspiracy theorists argue that the pictures taken on the moon are of great quality or studio quality, and amateur photographers like the astronauts couldn't possibly take them. But that's not true. The astronauts took plenty of awful pictures. NASA only released the good ones. Secondly, the occasion makes the picture. It doesn't matter how bad the astronauts were at photography. The first pictures from the moon would always have a surreal quality that would make them more momentous than they might have been otherwise. These counter-arguments do not sway conspiracy theorists, and their overarching rationale isn't all that wrong. These theorists believe that the American government is intrinsically deceitful, and lettered agencies like NASA, CIA, and the FBI often undertake incredible projects to mislead the public. Some examples include MKUltra, an illegal human experimentation program carried out by the CIA, and Operation Northwoods, a proposed false flag operation against Cuba. The existence of these incredible programs means that the government isn't beyond telling blatant lies to the people to secure its interests. We must admit that that rationale does make sense. However, moon landing conspiracy theorists should understand that the same rationale disproves their point that the United States hasn't developed moon landing technology by 1969. The government is always working on secret technology, and a good example of that is Bluetooth, the internet, and the nuclear bomb. Therefore, any attempts at estimating the technical capacity of the US government will probably be based on false information. Accordingly, it's impossible to say that the United States hadn't developed space exploration technologies by 1969, since we don't know what the government is working on at any point in time. The nuclear bomb, for example, was just as complex and perhaps even more difficult to develop than the rockets that took man to space, and the government built it way back in 1945. Yes, it may be sensible to have a healthy distrust of the US government, but that distrust may be rational. If you loved this video, don't forget to smash the like and subscribe buttons. Goodbye and stay safe.